have an impact on a judge?
So I wasn't in the courtroom, Chris, but I think judges can see beyond that. I think maybe sometimes juries fall for that sort of thing just because they are not in courtrooms frequently enough to know those kinds of things. So yeah. I don't know that that had an impact on the judge here. But it is a low sentence. And, you know, the sentencing guidelines are not something that the prosecutor made up out of a whole cloth. The U.S. Sentencing Commission creates those numbers based on real data of real cases around the country. The purpose for having them is to provide uniformity in sentencing around the country so that if you're sentenced in Washington or Virginia or New York or Texas, you're likely to get the same sentence. And so when this judge says, I think these guidelines are too high, he is really just substituting his own judgment for the judgment of the U.S. Sentencing Commission. The judge is allowed to vary, but only if he can articulate a reason why the guidelines overstate the conduct in this particular case. And I didn't hear him say that.
Tom Witter, you're joining us right now. Tom, it seems to me this judge talks and judges and rules and gives sentences like he's a sequestered juror, like he doesn't know this whole matter we're talking about. He doesn't seem to understand the business that Manafort's been in all these years. Well, he's working as a mercenary for Putin's people. He acts like a blameless life. What is he talking about?
Chris, you raised the exact point that I was going to make, which is that this is not in a vacuum. The sentencing is not in a vacuum. And while he really kind of can't consider some of the things that David Corn and you have been speaking about and others have been talking about as it relates, because it wasn't charged in this case, his interactions with Konstantin Kilimnik or anything involving Russia. What he needs to consider and what he was told about, because it was entered into the docket because we watch it every single day, was the lies that he told to the special counsel as part of his cooperation. It was his behavior, his lies to the grand jury. What a federal judge, his counterpart in Washington, D.C., determined that he lied on 3 separate occasions to the special counsel after he's pleaded guilty, that he was involved with witness tampering because he was notified of the charges that were brought in Washington, D.C. So the judge can't look at this in a vacuum. And I'm just, frankly, very surprised, and I don't use those words lightly, that he didn't look at the totality of the behavior that was brought to him in court filings, the totality of the behavior that he's been charged with, that he was notified of. So if he wants to look at it from purely a bank fraud and tax fraud perspective and what other people have been found guilty of before and sentenced to before, I can see the kind of the downward move from the sentencing guidelines. But that's not the case here, Chris. And I think another thing that we really need to consider here with respect to the judge, and Barbara McQuaid is unsurprisingly perfectly accurate when she says that he has a reputation for being light on white-collar crime. He does. What the judge is not kind of understanding here, Chris, and what I think is surprising is that when you look at his conduct and you look at now time served being added to this, there's not much difference between Michael Cohen's sentence of 3 years and what is now essentially just barely above 3 years for Paul Manafort. And you look at the tax and bank fraud differences between those two people, and the gulf is enormous. Now, granted, Michael Cohen's also being sentenced for the campaign finance crimes, but when you look at the totality of the behavior here, it's really very surprising.
Malcolm, how are they viewing this in Moscow, do you think, today? Is Putin saying, my buddy got off pretty easy today, didn't he? What do they think of our justice system, that a guy that was facing up to 20 years got 4, or less than 4? Malcolm?
I think the Kremlin believes that they now have managed to engineer the U.S. justice system by putting their man in the White House, and through his influence or his stature, he has managed to get someone who is really an agent of the Kremlin, someone who has been paid by Moscow for almost 2 decades now to carry out their operations in the Ukraine and other parts of the world. You know, if I was Robert Mueller, I think now is the time to throw a secret haymaker. I would bring him up on Espionage Act charges for his contacts with Konstantin Kilimnik. Or something along the lines of conspiracy to defraud the United States. I wouldn't let this stand, and I would make it clear that there are more tricks in the bag of the special counsel.
Well, Malcolm, so much of this case against the president has been about his relations with Russia, the obstruction of justice matters, which I'll deal with the next several months, I expect. For example, going to Comey, the head of the FBI, our top police force, basically, in this country's investigative unit, and saying, lay off my director of national security because he was dealing with Putin and dealing with Kislyak and everybody. Lay off him. And then he fires the FBI director because he wouldn't lay off him. Then he fires his attorney general because he recused himself and wouldn't help Trump in this matter. Over and over again, the president has not only done stuff, but he's doubled down in obstructing justice against himself. And today, he must be having dessert tonight at the White House. Your thoughts on that, Malcolm?
Well, absolutely. And again, this shows that the puppet strings go from Moscow to the White House and now down into the U.S. judiciary. Whether the judge had any influence on the president at all, that doesn't matter. It's the fact that the lawyer came out and said there was nothing to do with Moscow. That shows where the influence